This video is sponsored by War Thunder. From the Hoarfrost Stomp to the Lightning Perfume Bottles, these are the most broken weapons in the history of Elden Ring. Starting with the Icerind Hatchet. You might remember the speedruns players were cooking up on the launch week of the game, and the main weapon of choice being the Icerind Hatchet, something that was very accessible from the start of the game in Liurnia and harbored the Hoarfrost Stomp Ash of War, which is a pretty solid skill, right? But it was even more busted back then, which caused a great chunk of damage and frostbite buildup in quick succession. Most of the runs would have you picking up the hatchet, then traveling to the Volcano Manor as the Godskin Stitcher and Royal Knight's Resolve were in close proximity. Back then, there was a bug that allowed the 80% damage buff from Royal Knight's Resolve to apply to the other weapon instead of the weapon the Ash of War was applied to, which in turn would buff the damage of the hatchet and ruined every boss from Malekith onwards. This was the speedrunning meta for a little bit before people got the hang of beating the game without fighting at all. And eventually, in patch 1.03, the Royal Knight's Resolve bug was fixed, and the Hoarfrost Stomp received a damage nerf with the casting time being increased. Speaking of things you get really early in the game, the Bloodhound's Fang has been and still is a really solid choice for a weapon throughout every stage of the game. You get it from Darrowil, probably the first ever jail boss you will fight in Limgrave. If you spec into dexterity, you will do an absurd amount of damage on hit to pretty much anything, and the Ash of War Bloodhound's Finesse just did even more with your somersault slash into a Bloodhound step attack. One of the most underrated things about this weapon is the fact that you can enchant it with magic or buff it with consumables, which allow you to apply things like Blasphemous Blade, which increases its built-in hemorrhage buildup. You might think that for something you get this early in the game and this versatile across the board, it would have received some pretty nasty nerfs. But surprisingly, no. If anything, it was buffed with the 1.09 patch as the speed, range, recovery time, and guard counter speed for all curved greatswords was increased. The jump attacks also got even stronger than they already were. Next, we can't talk about broken weapons without talking about the Sword of Night and Flame. While it wasn't obtainable as immediate as the other two, it was still relatively accessible in the early to mid game if you knew where to look. Its light and heavy attacks are pretty good, but the real damage came from speccing into intelligence and faith, and making sure you were using nothing, and I mean nothing, apart from the deadly Ash of War Night and Flame stance, where you could shoot out a comet to inflict magic damage or a flame burst for fire. They would absolutely destroy any boss unfortunate enough to come into contact with it, and even so at the minimum stat requirement for them. There was a good amount of videos detailing how to break the game early using this weapon, but the damage of the skill was decreased in patch 1.03 update. Still incredible. While we could quantify weapons as anything that you hold your left or right hand or have in your memory, we have to give the Mimic Tear another mention. Of course, many people will call Spirit Ash easy mode, but just look at the previous three we've mentioned. We're Elden Ring guys. Of course we say Mimic Tear is for noobs, but secretly use it ourselves. Even to this day, this guy is absolutely a force to be reckoned with. It copies all of your weapons, your armor, your spells, with stat requirements to use them in whatever broken build you yourself are using. Bosses will be dealt with in twice the manpower. Prior to patch 1.03, it was just a beast, and even after its damage nerf and the buffing of most Spirit Ashes in patch 1.13, Mimic Tear still outclasses, well, honestly all of them. Sometimes in battle, you need to summon the realest guy you know, and you can always count on a Mimic Tear. Another thing players could count on was the Comet Azur. Oh my god, do I even need to explain how this wasn't one of the craziest spells ever made? Sure, it required a little admin to get the Jelly Shield, Terra Magica, and Cerulean Hidden Tear alongside the spell, but the end result was worth it. Many people would summon seemingly normal magic users, but find out they summoned Dumbledore himself. This inspired so many players to use this exact one pump build to decimate just about any boss's health. While it is mostly cheese and many didn't like the idea of it doing this much damage, I will play devil's advocate and say that the setup it required and the need for bosses to just sit still was a perfectly fine drawback to the issue. Comet Azur was surprisingly never touched by any nerfs ever, but the setup items were. In patch 1.12 alone, the Jellyfish Shield skill, which increased attack power, was decreased from 20% to 12.5%. Terra Magica's magic raising strength decreased from 35% to 22.5% in PvE, and the Cerulean Hidden Tear's duration was decreased to just 10 seconds. It's definitely not the king of the hill anymore, but it was great while it lasted. Something that lasted for a long time, however, is the Death's Poker. Its normal attacks are nothing to write home about in the slightest. They do okay damage, but its Ash of War skill does an absurdly high amount of damage with an explosion or sheet of Ghost Flame, which costs a super low 15 FP to just decimate a boss or a group of enemies. It increases magic damage by 100% and applies Frostbite like the tarnished microdoses Shadow Tree fragments. When the Sword of Night and Flame got nerfed, a lot of people turned to this weapon as a really good replacement to break the game really early on, and it was just overall a really amazing choice. One pretty popular choice for rune level 1 runs back in the day, and honestly a good one all around, was the Marais Executioner Sword. If you ever fantasize about having Yondu's Whistle Needle from Guardians of the Galaxy, then you can kind of live out this reality with it. Of course, you need all the right talismans to make this thing shine as a historically fantastic broken weapon, but it's well worth it. The damage output with a well-placed Ash of War just eliminates the red off of a health bar in such fast succession, and a tiny 15 FP cost as well. The skill also counts as a dancing attack, so using the brand new Dancer's set with the 10% dancing damage bonus will just amplify it even more. Moving on to our next broken weapon, we have the Fighter Jet spell. In Elden Ring, War Thunder, one of, if not the most versatile game in this vehicle war genre out there to date, and it's currently free for PC, PlayStation, and Xbox. Which other broken builds give you 2,500 different tanks, planes, helicopters, and battleships of 10 major nations from all throughout history to control? Immerse your build, your big back build, in the world of fast-paced and intense combat against all manner of intricately designed vehicles that you will face while playing. It also features an extensive amount of customization options, my favorite. So you, the player, can build the vehicle of your dreams with a vast range of camouflages and decorations. Best of all, new players or players that haven't played in 6 months will receive an epic bonus pack that includes multiple premium vehicles, the exclusive vehicle decorator Eagle of Valor, 100,000 silver lions, and 7 days of a premium account. It's not available for forever, so get it while you can. Thank you again to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Another fond memory is how many runners back in the day found out about the insane stagger capability of Flame of the Redmanes, literally calling it Hoarfrost Stomp 2.0. Slapping it on a katana, a dagger, or a misericord was really all you needed. And then in 2 to 4 hits on a boss, it would stagger it, which sounds like a lot, but considering that 14 FP cost and a rather reliable windup time, this was no joke in the slightest, and would just turn it into a game of Uno against bosses. Except you only have skip cards in your hand. In patch 1.08, this had a crazy nerf, from 40 poise damage to just 10, and unfortunately just becoming nothing remarkable in the face of other weapons. Speaking of, let's touch on the 2 fabled katanas, Moonveil and Rivers of Blood, which I have already covered extensively in previous videos, so you should totally go check those out. I'll keep these brief, but let's start with Moonveil, one of the most popular, powerful, and safest option for all players. Which shouldn't come as a surprise. Having this alongside a well-spec'd intelligence build will have you decimate hordes of enemies as you traverse the land with its spectacular Ash of War, and will just genuinely do really reliable damage to a boss. And Moonveil's twin, the Rivers of Blood, shares the same sentiment, but to a much higher degree. The Corpse Piler Ash of War does an astonishing amount of damage to all bosses, and if you spec your build with the right talismans, you will just greatly increase the damage output on anything and everything that bleeds. But next on the list, we have probably one of the top 3 most broken weapons right now, and one of my personal favorites that carried me through the DLC, the Blasphemous Blade. Its normal attack and skill damage is absolutely still insane, and even more so with its signature lifesteal abilities. If anything, it really just got buffed with the 15% bonus to magma damage with the Talisman of Dread, and the synergy potential across the board is just nuts. Its ability to just collateral through hordes of enemies, take health from bosses, and do damage reliably just ascends it to the top of the entire history of broken weapons. Not to mention, this one was actually buffed a long time ago, so in its very original state, it was a lot worse than what it is now. Let's take a look back at some of the old exploits. Giza's Wheel, or the true name, the Pizza Cutter, was a pretty fun weapon to play around with in the game, but when using one of its most infamous exploits in Elden Ring called the Chainsaw Glitch, it turned the Pizza Cutter into, you know, a freaking chainsaw, but with the body of a popsicle stick or the Serpent Hunter. You obtain this power by doing a series of inputs as shown, and this worked with a lot of other weapons too, like flails, and just turned the heavy attack of the Serpent Hunter into a stupidly strong weapon. The Serpent Hunter requires no stat allocation to use it, so if you could get your hands on it and you were good at positioning, say hello to a favorable speedrunning time, because this would melt bosses. There's a really good video covering this topic, so I recommend you go see it for yourself to see how crazy it was. It was also one of the longest unpatched exploits in the game until recently. Something that didn't last forever was the crazy incantation that was Fire's Deadly Sin. This thing sets the area around you and the player ablaze, which works well for things like resetting frostbite or doing small amounts of damage to enemies around the player. But for a while, it had a really crazy bug. First off, we have to mention the Erdtree Greatshield. The Erdtree Greatshield has the Golden Retaliation skill, which repels any spell or incantation into a holy blast. Which sounds good if you're strolling through Raya Lucaria or something, but back in the day, the self-receiving damage from Fire's Deadly Sin technically counted as an incantation, so it tricked the game into thinking that there was an enemy attacking the player, and in turn let them dispel the holy blast constantly until you had to reapply Fire's Deadly Sin, and if you had stacked up on a talisman and physic tiers, you would just decimate any threat health bar in quick succession. This was fixed in patch 1.03, however. For the next bug, we have the Eclipse Shuttle and the Death Blight. Fire's Deadly Sin also had a funny little issue where the small area of effect fire damage that enemies take within the player's vicinity. It would also apply the current affinity of whatever weapon the player was holding alongside that damage. So using the Eclipse Shuttle skill would apply Death Blight to itself, on top of Fire's Deadly Sin's AoE damage. It would also do AoE Death Blight buildup to any player in the vicinity, and do so at a rather moderate speed. There were deterrents for the build, but before it got patched, not a lot of unsuspecting hosts knew about it, and a lot of brokenness just came from the fact that you didn't need to be active in combat at all, just that all you had to do was run up to another player and dodge, while you wait for the buildup to do its thing. Don't forget about Mr. Beat the Allegations' special weapon, the Mogwyn Sacred Spear. This was another thing that got nerfed on the expansion launch, with its bleed buildup rate decreasing, but even that can barely stop the mayhem this thing causes. Its piercing damage does a rather hefty amount, and alongside the skill, has some crazy hyper armor. I am not sure what needs to be said about blood builds in this game that the community doesn't already know. It's just flat out broken overall, and while it does have a long charge up, the payoff is wild, and especially so if you plug in the White Mask and Lord of Blood's Exaltation into the mix. If you know what you're doing in regards to positioning, this is absolutely lethal for any boss fight. Thankfully, the FromSoftware's staple weapon is actually a really viable one in this game. It doesn't do as much damage with its skill as it once did in prior expansions, however, landing a projectile in close proximity with a stack of magic enhancing buffs will have you wondering why it wasn't nerfed any further. It does extremely reliable damage, and after imbuing itself with magic, will increase the magic damage by 65, and add frost to it, whilst allowing the player to use a heavy attack to throw blasts of moonlight at enemies, and honestly works super well with the Jellyfish's shield bonus damage even after its nerf. It's still one of the perfect weapons for your wizards and witches out there, and honestly in the best taste to use if you became the consort of Ranni the Witch. It is your wedding gift after all. Before we move on to the most notable broken DLC weapons, we arrive at some honorable mentions that I would like to bring up fast but loud, so strap in. Shard of Alexander. Not a weapon, but without it would make so many of the weapons a fraction of their potential. And what better item to receive from our best pot friend ever. Lord of Blood's Exaltation. Same sentiment as the Shard, but can be stacked on top of it for blood weapons and just amplifies damage to the max. Lion's Claw. Honestly, one of the biggest easy modes in the game if you put it on the right weapon and use Royal Knight's Resolve alongside it. Black Knife Tiche. Mimic Tier is great, but so many use Tiche as well, and it's not fair that she doesn't get the same credit, especially with her insane versatility of movement and her crazy Deathblight attack. Spiked Fist. It is a broken weapon, but not much to say apart from it's fast and deals an absurd amount of damage and stagger potential. Only drawback is its range for some bosses. And finally, double twin blades. These things still work and really effectively at that. Don't feel discouraged to use them, your character looks like they have so much fun with them. Moving on to our first broken DLC weapon, we have the Bloodfiend's Arm, an absolute unit of power for all strength and arcane builds out there. It got a small but trivial nerf, but it's as if it never existed in the first place. It is one of the best colossal weapons ever with an absolutely crazy R2 heavy attack that procs bleed faster than you can say bail on anything, and really just puts every other weapon to shame. Sure, it won't be the fastest thing ever, but it's honestly worth the drawback. You're using it for damage output, and this thing is damage in a detached limb form. Kai Cenat also used this weapon when he beat Radahn, so it's not like it's a hidden gem or anything. If you're all about your strength, you cannot go wrong with this. Another big Radahn killer was the Impenetrable Thorns sorcery, a volley of Shadow Tree thorns penetrating the health bar of anything that comes into contact with it. Now with the 1.13 nerf, it did see a huge decrease in poise damage, as much as it once did, as you can see here, but you still harbor an absolutely crazy range at a pretty fast speed and a really reliable rate of damage, and at a pretty low FP and health cost. And if you're super scaled into intelligence as well, you'll be doing a heck of a lot more magic damage on top of it. The biggest drawback to the spell and what separates it from most of the other broken builds towards the bottom is honestly its inconsistency at varying ranges and on hills. It's a great choice for sure, but pales in comparison to this next one. And for our final demigod level weapon, we have the Lightning Perfume Bottle. It is so unfortunate to see its performance now after the nerf, as it just is a shell of its former self. Not really doing its thing like it once did, even with a plethora of buffs. But this is about the history, and so if you missed this one on launch week, let me tell you, it was an actual force of nature. As if Zeus himself blessed the tarnish with his thunderbolts. After lathering your collection of buffs and wearing the right talismans, it would just let you do this. And just simply delete any enemy from the game. If you thought this DLC was hard, even with the Shadow Tree fragments, this was literally the dev tool to get you to any end of a fight. Whether you played solo with Spirit Ashes or with co-op summons, it would just out DPS anything else, and made the game a complete joke to the point where I think it's probably one of the most broken weapons in the entire history of the game. Of course, not anymore, but it had a really good run. So that was all of the most broken weapons in the history of Elden Ring's meta. One more big thank you to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. You can click the link in the pinned comment to play for free right now on PC, PlayStation, or Xbox. And remember, if you are new or haven't played in the last 6 months, you will get a huge bonus that includes multiple premium vehicles, in-game currency, and more. Let me know in the comments if I missed anything in regards to absolutely busted weapons from back in the day. My name is Evan, and hopefully, I explained that well.